so it is apt that we have come to do this work, which I think is not all what the take-home message is. It's not all doom and gloom. It's good that I'm following on from Ariane, and I think it's also going to relate to some of what Nicola has to say, so it's perfectly positioned. I want to acknowledge my co-PI, Justine, sitting in the back, so Justine Burns, just raise your hand. She's going to come in at some point. And much of this work is also being conducted with a number of postgraduate students, Patricia Chirwa, George Kinyanjui, Rowan Spazzoli, and Lindsay Roots. I'm not going to be talking to all of their contributions, but given the time, we'll pick a few of the more striking results. The title is Youth Empowerment in Marginalized Communities, and the evidence from this comes from a novel youth empowerment program called Activate Change Drivers. So I want to echo the sentiment expressed by Vimal earlier, in that it is quite important to start with, I think, specifying what sort of view of the world one has when one tries to interpret this type of work. So just a few seconds on the theory underlying the thinking behind this work, my beliefs, my model, if you want to call it that. So piggybacking off Patrizio's remarks earlier, the starting point for this is that low intergenerational mobility affects where you grow up and how you grow up. And marginalized, or to use the language of sociologists, distressed neighborhoods can be poverty traps. If the vast majority of young people that live in these types of neighborhoods become fatalistic, this could lead to a perpetuation of destructive behavior. So we look at things like substance abuse, unsafe sex, domestic violence. All of these outcomes, in a sense, in some way can be tied back to fatalism. And of course, young people that are born into these environments have formed beliefs about the world based on these perverted realities. And when these behaviors become entrenched, they become the norm, neighborhoods can become poverty traps. So what is the scope for public action if one accepts these premises? Well, one option, following the large-scale social experiments that have been conducted in many of the major US inner-city environments, is to move people to better opportunities. Now one can argue the politics of that as a policy option, but I think it's striking and important to note that by and large, the evidence on these so-called mobility experiments does not really make for good reading. Mostly, the outcomes, the impacts of these programs are not shown to be long-lasting. Recent study by Ludwig et al. In 2012, I think, is a very good example of that. So what other options are there? Well, another solution is to try and change the behavioral responses to distress by affecting what underlies fatalism. And of course, to attempt to do so, one needs to have a good idea of what these underlying drivers might be. The Activate Change Drivers program, as I said, is a youth empowerment program, and is one such initiative that is directed at this objective. If you're interested more in more about the program, you can go to the website, which is activateleadership.co.za, and there's a lot of information about what they try to do. In this talk, I hope to do two things. I'm going to talk about this program a little bit, and hopefully convince you that these types of interventions can be undertaken. And secondly, I hope to convince you that they have big consequences that do matter for the sorts of outcomes that we've been talking about throughout this morning. So what does Activate focus on? They talk about active social capital, the propensity to cooperate, to trust, to behave altruistically. There's also a focus on what economists would call preferences, the preferences for positive risk-taking, time discounting, how one values the future versus the present, or impatience, perceptions or beliefs. I've grouped trustworthiness, and I've placed trustworthiness under the rubric of perceptions, beliefs, because a lot of the evidence that we have actually in what is thought to be about trust from surveys turn out to be more indicative of trustworthiness. And it's important to keep in mind that these are distinct constructs, that is trust and trustworthiness. Corruption, they also focus on connecting up the participants that go through the Activate program, so they focus on networks, both across communities and across domains within communities. The people that are recruited for the program come from different sectors of civil society, mostly involving young people engaged in voluntary service in some or other kind, from environmental groups to groups that work with kids, to groups that work on the promotion of responsible sexual behavior. And the idea is to effectively equip the participants with a set of skills, as well as information and the activation of a network where they can collaborate in the different domains in which they are operating. The program content focuses on self-belief, aspirations, goal orientation, and resilience, creative thinking and problem solving, healthy lifestyle choices, communication skills, the use of technology, social networking, trust building, project management, political engagement. Before I describe the methodological approach we took to measuring impact, I want to very briefly talk about the main findings. Firstly, in terms of measuring many of these outcomes, we used a mixed methods approach. So both a combination of task and ask, if you will. So a lot of the outcomes of interest here cannot usefully be undertaken in a survey. There are some domains which we can talk about, but mostly we employed a variety of tasks to elicit the outcomes of interest. We also used extensive surveys on more traditional outcomes, which I will talk about in a second. So focusing first on the outcomes we measured through experiments, the first hypothesis is that the program will have increased pro-social preferences, by which we mean trust, altruism, cooperation. The items coded green are items, are domains in which we found positive impact of the program. The program altered preferences for risk and time discounting. And then outcomes measured through surveys. First area of interest is around mental health and affective states. Here we collected data on depression and happiness. The impact on depression is coded red. It is a very nuanced mechanism in operation. So the interpretation is not straightforward, and I'm going to spend some time looking at that in this presentation. The program improved perceptions and beliefs on trustworthiness. We found no effect on corruption. Partly our thinking here is that the program was very effective in terms of screening the participants. So on this domain, both those that went through the program and those that didn't showed very similar high levels of intolerance for corruption. The program had increased an impact on increased opportunities, not so much on employment, but on entrepreneurial initiative, and I will talk to that finding in a second. And it increased public innovation, in not an obvious way, and I've coded bargaining as a red outcome to indicate that, again here, the mechanisms at work are quite nuanced. And then finally, one of the main objectives is to connect up the participants. So we do see innovative social networking happening across a range of different types of activities. Okay. So the study design follows what's called a pipeline randomization. It's a randomized control trial. So a treatment control type of setup. The treatment group is constituted of people that were selected into the program. It differs from a standard experiment in that the control group were not denied participation but merely delayed participation. So effectively, one's place in the queue is randomly assigned. The treatment group went through the program in 2014 and the control group in 2015. And importantly, we measured the outcomes for the control group prior to entry into the program, so at the beginning of 2015. And this design is thought to be effective at mitigating selection bias, firstly because of the focus on successful applicants, secondly, the randomization element balances out the pre-existing differences between the two groups, and we showed this statistically. Okay, the first type of outcome I want to talk about is trust. We measured trust and trustworthiness through what's called the trust game, which I'll outline in a second. But then also had a variety of survey-based questions that we administered, which capture either perceptions or beliefs about it is thought to trust, but the consensus that we read in the literature is that mostly the questions in surveys are about trustworthiness. In terms of cooperation and altruism, we employed the prisoner's dilemma game, the public goods game, and the dictator game. Risk aversion and time discounting were also measured through experiments. For risk aversion, we gave participants the choice of choosing between incentivized lotteries, between safe and more risky options. And then we measured time discounting, again using a mechanism where we measured the discount rate or the interest rate, so to speak, that would make subjects indifferent between receiving a payoff now versus delaying that payoff to some time in the future. Mental health and affect. We measured mental health through the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression screen, or the CESD-10. And affect was measured through the positive and negative affect schedule, short form PANAS-SF. And then in terms of opportunities, we had the standard survey, which measured educational attainment and employment. And then finally, public innovation and connectedness, measured again through the survey, looking at civic engagement, and we also employed a bargaining experiment. Finally, survey questions on group memberships and the types of resources that people had access to in their communities. Okay. So I'm going to talk about trust for a second. So the trust experiment that we employed, also known as the investment game, works as follows. You have a player A and a player B. Player A is endowed with a sum of money and told that they are paired with an anonymous individual whom they have a choice to interact with or not. If they choose to interact, they get to pass some amount of money over to the player B. They're told that they can pass any of the endowment from 0 all the way up to all of it. The responder receives a larger amount than player A passes to them. It's usually multiplied by some factor. In this example, it's a factor of 3. In our case, it was a factor of 2. So the idea is that whatever A passes on to B is amplified by some social process, and then B gets to respond with a return, which could be, of course, something extremely low, or something extremely high, or something in between. So the behavior of the proposer, or the player A, we attribute to a trust motive. So in this experiment, by backward induction, if A does not trust B, A will send nothing in return, and B does not obviously get to respond. Of course, what's socially optimal in this experiment is for A to transfer all of the endowment to B, and for B to return an equal split of the amount that B has. The behavior of B is usually an indicator of trustworthiness. So in this experiment, we can measure both trust, the behavior of A, and trustworthiness, the behavior of B. The way we effected the experiment is we randomly split the program participants into the A's and B's, the trusters and the trustees, for both the treatment and the control group. The partners of the trusters were always non-participants, and they were told that they were matched with anonymous strangers off-site, and both A's and B's possessed the same knowledge of the game. Now, I don't have an equation, but I do have this picture. I'll leave it to you to figure out which are the X's and which are the Y's. Actually, what I would like for you to do is think of the activate box as the X and everything else as a Y. So these are the outcomes in the trust domain that we measured. So the first point is that the impact of activate on behavioral trust, measured through the trust game, is positive, but it seems to be working through a change in beliefs. The direct effect of activate on beliefs is positive, and we only detect a positive effect on behavioral trust if the impact through this channel is also positive. The second interesting finding is, and this turns out to be an important mechanism that mediates some of these effects, is that activate lowers depression for the male participants in the experiment relative to the female participants. Now, this is interesting in and of itself, but it also appears that the impact that activate has on trustworthiness moves in the opposite direction in terms of gender. It has a positive effect on the trustworthiness of women, and this appears to be in some sense mediated by the fact that the depression of the male participants goes down relative to females, and I'll talk about that in greater detail in the next slide. So what do we make of this result? Well, detecting depression in men is difficult. There's a range of issues related to misdiagnosis. Depression is often hidden because it's in conflict with ideas of masculinity. But an important meta-analysis of the evidence shows just how difficult it can be to recognize and communicate symptoms of depression on the part of the study subjects. There's also finding that action-oriented collaborative approaches, i.e. group therapy, works better than one-on-one therapy. This type of group therapy called the Men's Stress Workshop, which is a targeted form of CBT for depressed men, seems to have an interesting structure that mirrors the way the Activate trainings function. Groups of 8 people, or rather 8 groups that ran for an hour-and-a-half sessions, focusing on the idea of self and making better decisions. Am I up? Okay. And we have evidence that this sort of approach works particularly well for men. But it also has this interesting consequence for women. This is stated somewhat incorrectly here, where it says it leads women to become more trustworthy. Rather, what we find is that because the program reduces the depression for men, the impact of the program on the trustworthiness of women works through this interesting channel where the average depression levels of women actually translates into a sort of self-signaling by women exhibiting behaviors of higher trustworthiness. And there is some evidence for this, that mental health can work in this way. There's an interesting study published last year that shows that people with a history of mood disorders, particularly bipolar 1 disorder and major depressive disorder, exhibit more trustworthiness in the trust game. So we don't want to overinterpret our result, but this particular experiment and this particular study seems to be consistent with this finding that even though the depression of men declined, trustworthiness on the part of women went up as a consequence of the program.